Neuroscience has spent decades studying why some people buckle under pressure while others don't. They have mapped the prefrontal cortex, they have tracked cortisol pattern, they have studied elite military units, Olympic athletes, and Fortune 500 executives, and yet almost none of that research has been applied to one of the most extraordinary, real-world laboratories of human resilience that has ever existed. Community that survived colonization, forceful displacement, generational poverty, and systemic erasure, and produced people who are still here, still building, and still creating meaning. That's not a motivational observation. That is a scientific question that deserved a scientific answer. Today, I'm giving you that answer. This is the neuroscience of African mental resilience. And by the end of this video, you will understand not just what makes certain people unbreakable, but exactly which neural mechanisms are responsible and how to activate them deliberately. Let's get into it. Let's start with the foundational architecture. To understand resilience at the neuroscience level, you need to understand 4 systems and how they talk to each other. The first one is the prefrontal cortex, which is your discipline headquarters. The prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is the region responsible for what neuroscientists call executive function, which is goal persistence, impulse regulation, long-term planning, and the ability to delay immediate reward for future gain. This is neurologically where discipline lives. But here's what's critical to understand. The prefrontal cortex is not fixed. It is neuroplastic, meaning its functional strength is shaped by repeated experience, by the quality of your stress environment, and critically, by the meaning you assign to that stress. When your prefrontal cortex is consistently activated under manageable stress, stress that is buffered, contextualized, and purposeful, it gets stronger. The neural pathway becomes more efficient through a process called long-term potentiation. Repeated firing of neurons together strengthen the synaptic connection between them. As the Erb's law described, neurons that fire together wire together. This is neuroplasticity, and is the biological basic of why discipline can be built, not just inherited. The second one is the amygdala, the threat detector that overrides everything. Now, this is the prefrontal cortex's greatest adversary, the amygdala, your brain's threat detection system. Under perceived threat, the amygdala fires rapidly and sends signals that effectively suppress the prefrontal cortex activity. This is the mechanism behind what's sometimes called the amygdala hijack. When you are stressed, or overwhelmed, or in a perceived danger, your capacity for executive function like planning, impulse control, goal persistence goes offline in real time. This is not a character flaw. This is neurobiology. And here's where it becomes directly relevant to discipline. Chronic, unmanaged stress keeps the amygdala in a semi-permanent activation state. When that happens, your brain gradually reorganizes to prioritize survival over growth. Cortisol, which is your primary stress hormone, begins to suppress the very same pathways you are trying to build. You cannot willpower your way out of a chronically dysregulated nervous system. The system that produces willpower is the very same system that's being suppressed. The third one is the HPA Axis, which is your stress load accounting system. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis governs cortisol release and stress recovery. Every time you face stress, your HPA axis activates, and what matters for long-term resilience isn't whether it's activated, but it's how fast and completely it recovers. Researchers measure the accumulated cost of chronic under-recovered stress as allostatic load, essentially the running total of physiological weight from stress your body processed but didn't fully reset. High allostatic load has measurable effect, which is degraded immune function, impaired memory consolidation, reduced emotional regulation capacity, and critically reduced prefrontal cortex volume over time. Here is what the research shows and matters most in keeping allostatic loads low. It is not the absence of stress, but it's the presence of two things: social buffering and perceived meaning. We will come back to both of those because they are at the very center of everything. The fourth one is the default mode network, which is where identity lives. Now, the default mode network activates when you are not focused on external tasks. This is where your brain constructs and updates your narrative identity, which is who you understand yourself to be, where you come from, and where you are going. Research in psychological neuroscience show that people with a coherent, redemptive narrative identity, a story in which hardship is part of a meaningful growth, not random suffering, demonstrate significantly better prefrontal amygdala connectivity. Their prefrontal cortex is more able to regulate their amygdala response when stress hits. This is why the story you carry about who you are directly influences how your brain handles pressure. Now, keep those four systems in your head because what I'm about to show you is exactly which ones Western productivity systems hit and which ones they completely miss. Okay, let me be precise here. The Western productivity model has real value, and I use elements of it, but it was built on a set of assumptions that don't hold up neurologically. And when you map it against the four systems we just covered, the gaps are obvious. Let me show you what I mean. The first gap is the Western productivity treats discipline as a willpower budget. The dominant Western productivity frame, which was popularized by researchers and then turbocharged by the self-help industry, treated willpower as a depletable resource, which you use it for one task and you have less for the next. Now, the neuroscience problem is this. This framework trains people to fear depletion and manage scarcity rather than to build actual prefrontal cortex robustness through progressive stress exposure. It confuses fatigue, which is a real temporal state, with structural capacity, which neuroplasticity actually improves over time. You cannot build a strong muscle by resting it consistently and rationing its use. And you cannot build a strong prefrontal cortex by treating it as a fragile resource that needs constant protection from effort. The second gap is it optimizes for individual performance and strip out the social buffering. This is the most consequential gap and one of the most replicated findings in behavioral neuroscience closes it definitively. Social buffering, which is the reduction in threat response that occurs in the presence of trusted social connection, has been documented across both animal models and human studies. The perception of being supported by others measurably reduces amygdala reactivity and speed up the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis recovery after stress. Oxytocin, released during authentic social bonding, directly inhibits the CRH, which in long term, the corticotropin releasing hormone, which is one of the primary initiators of the cortisol cascade. Every productivity system that moves accountability online and solo, like habit tracker, private journaling, self-monitored streak, is running high-performance demand through a nervous system that has been removed from its primary buffering mechanism. So, under sufficient pressure, the amygdala overwhelms the prefrontal cortex every time. And then people blame themselves for lacking discipline. While they were not lacking discipline, they were lacking the neurological infrastructure to sustain it. The third gap is it replaces narrative identity with manufactured motivation. The Western productivity solution to meaning is external. Things like vision boards, find your why, exercises, motivational content you consume until you are inspired enough to act. But here's a neuroscience problem. Manufactured motivation is emotionally top-down. It relies on cortical activation in the moment, not on stable neural identity architecture built over time. The default mode network, which is where the narrative identity actually lives, does not update through a single journaling session. It updates through repeated, emotionally significant experiences that are integrated into an ongoing self-story. That process takes time, consistency, and crucially, community validation. Motivation evaporates when the emotional state that generated it fades, but narrative identity stays when motivation is completely absent, because identity isn't a feeling, it is a structure. The fourth gap is it provides no threshold architecture. Perhaps the most underappreciated failure in Western productivity is it is structurally endless. There's no defined threshold, no recognized completion, and no marked transition from one state of development to another. There's only more optimization, more productive versions of yourself to chase indefinitely. Neurologically, defined threshold matters. Goal completion activates the dopaminergic reward pathway, which then reinforcing the behavior that led to completion. So without clear completion architecture, the reward signal is chronically deferred, and dopaminergic system respond to that deferment by down-regulating baseline motivation. This is not theoretical. This is why the people most committed to endless self-optimization are often the most quietly depleted. Now let's be precise about something here. What I'm mapping here are not racial or biological differences. What I'm mapping here are the neural mechanisms activated by specific cultural practices that appear across many African traditions and philosophies, particularly those rooted in Ubuntu and communal resilience. Culture shapes behavior. Behavior shapes neurology. That's the chain. Alright, here we go. Pathway 1. Ubuntu and the social buffering network. I am because we are is not merely a philosophical statement. As a lived practice, making decisions relationally, holding accountability communal, processing hardship within a social container, it is a systemic social buffering protocol. Every time discipline is witnessed by a trusted community, the nervous system receives a co-regulation signal that you are not alone in this threat. Cortisol output decreases. Amygdala reactivity lowers. The prefrontal cortex stays online much longer under pressure. What Western psychology has spent millions of dollars studying in clinical co-regulation therapy, Ubuntu philosophy embedded it into daily social architectures centuries ago. Pathway 2. Oral tradition and narrative identity circuit. Across many African cultural traditions, the elders don't just tell stories for entertainment, they transmit a resilience archive, a structured narrative of what this lineage has faced, survived, and adapted to, delivered repeatedly, emotionally, and in community. Neurologically, this is repeated, emotionally significant updating of the default mode network's narrative identity architecture. It does precisely what the Western find your way framework tried to do in a single session, except it does it through repeated reinforcement, community validation, and emotional salience over years. The result is what I call inherited narrative capital, a pre-existing story of resilience that the individual can draw before they have personally proven to themselves. When stress hit, instead of a blank page, something like, I don't know if I can do this, but instead there is a library of things like, I come from people who have already done harder things than this. Pathway 3, rites of passage and threshold-based dopaminergic reinforcement. The formal rites of passage present in many African cultures are neurologically a precisely structured dopaminergic reward architecture. They define a clear beginning. You are entering this threshold, a defined challenge structure, specific demands within specific time, a community witnessing. Your effort is socially validated in real time, a clear completion. You have crossed. You are now recognized as different. Every component of that structure maps directly to optimum dopaminergic function. 1. Defined goal, which focuses the neural reward prediction. 2nd, community witnessing, which adds social reward signal on top of achievement signal. 3rd, clear completion, which triggers full dopamine release and reinforces the behavioral pathway. 4th is community recognition, which then cement the identity update in the default mode network. Now compare that to do this habit for 66 days and maybe eventually you feel like a different person. The reinforcement architecture isn't even close. Pathway 4 is collective hardship framing and cognitive appraisal. This is the final pathway, and one of the most clinically significant is how hardship is appraised within a communal cultural frame versus an individualistic one. Cognitive appraisal, which was established by Lazarus and Folkman, shows that the physiological stress response is not only determined by the stressor itself, but it's determined by how the stressor is evaluated. Two people facing identical hardship produced measurably different cortisol responses based completely on their appraisal of it. So, in an individualistic frame, hardship appraises as personal failure, isolation, and evidence of inadequacy. Threat level is very high. Amygdala response is very strong, and the prefrontal cortex suppression significant. But on the other hand, a communal cultural frame, hardship appraises as part of a shared, meaningful, ongoing story, expected, not shameful, collectively navigated, and threat level is contextually reduced. Amygdala response buffered, and prefrontal cortex suppression mitigated. This is not a soft motivational reframe. It is a measurable change in cognitive appraisal that produces measurably downstream differences in cortisol output, immune function, and executive capacity. Now, the framework itself doesn't make the hardship smaller, but it changes the neurological category that the hardship lands in. And so that changes everything downstream. Now, everything I've walked you through today isn't abstract theory. These are specific, nameable neural mechanisms, and they can be systematically activated through structured practices. That's exactly why I built the 21-day program, build Unbreakable Discipline. Not habit tips, not willpower tricks, but a structured 21-day arc designed to activate social buffering, build your narrative identity, and give your nervous system the threshold architecture it was always missing. The link is down in the description below. If this video was useful to you, I'm honored to share this information with you. And if you want to work with me directly, one-on-one coaching to build this framework around your specific life, your specific stresses, the booking link is also below. If you want to go deeper on this channel exists because this conversation needs to exist. I'm glad you are in it. See you on the next one.